Welcome to Kepro's System Overview 1.1 training. Today, we are going to learn how to register in Atrezo.
To register for the Kepro Atrezo Provider Portal, you will need your facility or clinic's NPI and Medicaid ID. The first thing you're going to do after you enter the URL is to click here. If you don't already have a Kepro account, you can register here. Registration is the first step. This is just a one-time process, and this will be completed by the provider group administrator, and that will be the person who will manage the entire group. Okay, so we're going to click here to register. You'll enter in your NPI and Medicaid ID and click Next. On the next screen, you're then going to be able to create the username and then enter in contact information. If the username you select is not available, you will get an indicator that it is not available. That'll then allow you to enter in another user ID. And once you click outside of the box, it will then give you the green check if it is available. Again, you're going to enter in the contact information. The contact information is actually going to be the contact information for the person who's going to be the provider group administrator. Enter in the email and then confirm the email. And then the fax number is also required. All required fields are indicated with the red asterisk. Once those fields are completed, you'll then click Next. The email address is very important as this will be used during the multi-factor authentication registration process. Once we click Next, we'll then indicate that the registration has been successful and we have to complete the registration process. Okay, so you do have a time limit or you do get timed out of that process. So now we're going to click Login. Okay, and on this screen here, we're then going to indicate that we want to register the multi-factor authentication. The other thing is you do get an email that will come, and because I registered an email address through a Yahoo email account, you can actually see this right here. So this will be the email. This will be a sample email. Again, this is just a dummy account that is created for this registration training purpose. You can click the link in the email to complete the registration. Once you click that link, it's actually going to take you through the process here. And you're going to enter in the email that you entered. Okay. So this is the email that we entered during our registration for the group process. Okay. So enter in that email address, send the verification code. That code will then be sent to that email address. You'll be able to capture that code. But you do have to finish this process within a few seconds or you can be timed out. You'll then enter in a password. And this is the first time you're being asked to create the password, okay? So you'll have your email address and your password, which is going to be part of the multi-factor authentication process. Once you've entered in, you verified the email and you've entered in the password, you're going to click Create. And from here, it does give you the opportunity to save your password if you choose. And then from here, you're going to need to enter in a phone number in order to have a code sent to the phone or a phone call that can come. If you ask to have a phone call, what happens is you'll get a voice recording and you'll be asked to press a specified button, generally the pound sign, to specify that phone number. Otherwise, you can do send code, and it's going to send an SMS text to that phone. You'll then pull up that code and complete the registration. As soon as you enter the code, it knows you have enough digits there, and it automatically goes through the registration process for you then. Okay. The multi-factor authentication process, which was the process we just went through, that's a one-time registration process. Once you've registered your multi-factor authentication, you've verified the email address, you have then verified your phone number. That'll give you the opportunity now to use those two devices in order to authenticate your account in the future. Okay. To complete the login and registration, the very first time you log in, you'll have to complete the terms of use agreement. So I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom because there's a lot of text here. After you read the terms of use agreement, you then want to check the box that you've read and agree to the terms, and then click continue. You will then be brought to the home screen. Now remember that the group we created was our Denver provider, and the user is Daisy Duck. Daisy Duck is the provider group administrator. What that means is that Daisy Duck can manage multiple facilities and enter in additional users that can enter in requests and such in the system as well. As a provider group administrator, there will be an icon here in the center called Setup. So to add additional users, if I want to add additional users from Daisy Duck to this Denver provider group, I'm going to click Setup. Okay. On this screen right here, you can see I have one provider group that's registered. So if I expand this group, I can then see any users that are listed here. Okay. So Daisy Duck is the provider group administrator. And then we have a Dr. Gauze who's listed here as well, who's listed as a provider group administrator. Okay. With Dr. Gauze, if this is not the correct role, you can then change to a provider staff account. The provider staff account is the general user. That's the account that most everybody has. They can go into the system, generate the requests, view requests, send messages, view determination letters. Everything that needs to be done by a general user can be done with the provider staff account. The next option is the provider admin. The provider admin has very similar functionality to the provider group admin. The difference being is that the provider admin can help to manage and add users for just one provider group. Okay. The provider group administrator can then register additional NPIs and be able to manage multiple groups. So let's look and see what that looks like. If I scroll to the top of the page, and I as Daisy Duck am a provider group administrator, and I want to be able to register my other provider group, and so I'm going to click Register New Provider. Okay. When you click that option, again, you're going to need the NPI and the Medicaid ID. If you do not have an NPI, you would then enter the Medicaid ID in both the NPI field and the registration code field. Okay. So I'm going to select my NPI, and I'm going to select my Medicaid ID as my registration code, and I'm going to click Find Provider. Okay. It's going to give you the list and the information of the provider that's here. I'm going to check the box and select to add that provider. So this is kind of a confirmation. So now you can see I have Denver provider, but I also have a Colorado Springs provider. So Daisy Duck, as the provider group administrator, manages both this provider and this provider. Whereas the provider admin role, okay, if I have a provider admin, this person, Dr. Gauze, can manage the Denver provider group, but cannot manage the Colorado Springs provider group unless that person is added to that group. Okay. So what that looks like, what does it look like to add a new user? You want to work from the Manage Provider Groups tab. This makes it easier to manage. The Manage Users will list every user that the provider group administrator enters. And if you have a lot of staff, it can get really convoluted and difficult to follow. So work within the Manage Provider Groups to keep it simple. So I want to add a user to the Colorado Springs provider. So I'm going to expand that section. Okay, I'm going to scroll down so you can see. And I'm going to click Add New User. Okay. The provider group administrator, when you're adding a new user, you get to create the username. Okay. So you enter in the username. When you click outside of the box, it's going to tell you if that username is available or not available. Okay. If it is available, you get the green. Okay, so you keep going forward. Then you're going to enter in that contact's information. And you want to enter in the email address that they're going to use to verify the multi-factor authentication. So you want to make sure to use their organization's email. I'm just making up an email for the purpose of training at this point. All of the required fields must be entered. Once you enter in the required fields, including the fax, which is kind of down here at the bottom, so it can be a little bit of a straggler. If I hit create, if I miss this little requirement and I hit create, it's going to let me know that that's a required field. Okay. Enter in the fax number, your little warning goes away, and click create. When you add a new user, okay, so see, this shows you all the users that have been added, right? But I don't know without going through each one which group they're assigned to. So it's better to work within your Manage Provider Group tab. Okay. So the Manage Users, but click on your Manage Provider Groups to move over there. Your Colorado Springs provider, if I expand that down, now you're going to see that I have Donald Smith, who I just added as a user. It defaults to the provider staff account. If Donald Smith is actually going to assist with adding and managing users, they can be added as a provider administrator. Okay. The provider group administrator, again, is the one that is able to manage multiple groups. Okay, so generally you're going to have one provider group administrator, and you might have multiple admins and then multiple provider staff accounts. It's always nice to have at least one backup admin because you want to be able to have someone else that can fill in if you're out of the office or on vacation or something. So this way, this person can assist users if somebody new needs to be added or something happens with their account and they need the provider group administrator to reset a password or something. Okay. So adding multiple NPIs and registering NPIs can all be done under one login. So I, as Daisy Duck, if I click on my provider groups here, you can see that I actually have two provider groups that I'm overseeing and that I'm managing within this portal, but it will only be the same login credentials every time, okay? As a provider group administrator, I can also enter new requests. You have the same functionality that the general user does, but you want to make sure if you have access to multiple groups, you want to make sure that you're logged in under the proper provider group before you actually start to create a request. The way that you do that is under this context. So right here, I see that I'm logged in as the Denver provider, but if I needed to be logged in as the Colorado Springs provider to enter a new request, I would simply come to the change context. This will then allow me to change from the Denver provider to the Colorado Springs provider. And you click this little button here like you're trying to enter into the door. So you select that, and now your contract has changed to the Colorado Springs provider. Okay, so now any information that I create or any requests that I submit will now be listed under the Colorado Springs provider. Okay, So we want to make sure that that gets entered in correctly. Okay. At a later date, we'll go through processes if something is entered in by mistake, but that'll come later on in the training sessions later on in the month. Okay. So just to recap, when creating a new account, the provider group administrator is going to be the person that creates the account. The provider group administrator will then work under the Setup tab and then be able to add additional provider groups or list additional NPIs by clicking the Register New Provider. Once the additional providers are added, you're going to enter the NPI. If that facility or group does not have an NPI, the Medicaid ID will be used in place of an NPI in the same field. You would enter the Medicaid ID here for the NPI, and you would enter the Medicaid ID here for the registration code. Okay. Otherwise, you're going to enter in the NPI and the Medicaid ID. Click Find Provider. This is going to give you the provider here. You're checking the box to confirm and click Select. This will then add that group to your list. Okay, so the provider group administrator is able to manage multiple groups. Okay. Under each group or provider, you can then add in additional users. Okay. To add a new user, you're going to expand the provider you want to add the user to. Click Add New User. You're then going to enter in the username. And then when you click outside of the box, it's going to tell you whether that username is available or not available. Okay. You'll then be able to enter in their first name and their last name and their email. And again, you want to make sure that this will be the email that person is going to use for their multi-factor authentication. So generally, this is going to be their work email address. Also, the fax number is a required field. Okay. Once you enter in all the required fields, you then click Create. That person will then be added successfully. And again, you want to make sure that you stay under your Manage Provider groups. Okay, so we're going to stay under here. I added the user to this Aurora provider, so I'm going to expand that section. And my trainer sample that I added here, it defaults to the provider staff account. If this person needs to have the ability to enter requests under multiple groups, okay, they can be an admin where they could manage and add users under this group. But if I actually wanted to add this person, for example, to our Colorado Springs provider, what you would do in that situation, because you've already created them. So now what you're going to do is let's expand the Colorado Springs provider, and that will allow me to add the person by selecting the group right here, available users from your group. If I come to the drop down, here's my trainer sample. I check that option and I click Add. So you don't have to go through the process of creating the username and all that because that's already done. Again, you always want to work from this Manage Provider groups. It definitely is a lot easier. So I'm now going to expand the Colorado Springs provider again so that you can see that I added this person here. And they always default to the provider staff account. So every person that's added will always have the provider staff account as their user role. If that needs to be upgraded, for example, to the provider group at admin, that can be done at any time, okay? And they can be an admin or they can be moved back down to the staff account. So you can always, as the provider group administrator, you can always change those drop-down options, okay? So anything that has admin in it has very similar functionality. To go through them again, just to clarify, the provider group administrator will be the person who typically registers the account and then is able to manage multiple facilities or clinics or groups, okay? The provider administrator will have the ability to add and manage users, but is only able to do that to the group they're assigned to. The provider staff account is the general user, that's the default account. Every the provider group administrator, the provider administrator, and the provider staff account all have the exact same functionality when it comes to entering and viewing the requests that are entered into the system. The only difference between the staff accounts and the admin accounts is the ability to manage the group and manage the users. The functionality is the same otherwise. They all have the ability to enter requests. They all have the ability to view them, and that's all training that'll come at a later date. Okay. To reiterate again, if you're going to enter in as a provider group administrator or someone who has access to multiple accounts, right? So I put trainer sample under these two here as well. So when trainer sample logs in, trainer sample's also going to have to confirm before entering any requests which contract they're adding it under, okay? Or I say contract, which provider they're adding it under. So for example, the Colorado Springs provider, if I want to change that so that that's not the one that I'm logged in under, click change context. And then you actually have the choice. This will show you who you're currently logged in under, and then you can choose which provider is the one that you need to be logged in under. And you click the little box here to select that group, and then the page will refresh, and now you're logged in under that new provider. Okay. The setup functionality right here is only visible to the provider group administrators and the provider administrators. Those users that have a provider staff account, this tab here is hidden, and they're only going to see the tabs here across the top. Okay. Across the top right here under the user profile, this will also confirm the email address that's entered in. Okay. So again, under setup, you want to work under manage provider groups, register a new provider to add an additional group, work under each specified group to add new users. Okay. Click add new users, complete the required fields, and click create. And that will automatically add the associated users down to the section down here. Okay. If you want to add a user to a new group, you would then select the option right here. Oops, I don't have anybody extra, so let me go down here. Okay, and so under here, I can then select the user to add. And when I click add, it's going to add that user as a provider staff account. Okay. One of the other functionalities as a provider group administrator sometimes is resetting passwords, right? We have users that forget their password or something like that. There is a process that each user can go through if they have forgotten their password. However, if you are asked to help to reset their password, there is a process that you as the provider group administrator will be able to do for them. And this is functionality that the provider administrator will also have under their specified group only. As the provider group administrator, you're going to have access to every user that's been entered in under each group. So under the manage users, okay, this is where your manage users comes to play. If you have a user that tells you that they forgot their password, they need their password reset, whatever the situation might be for them, what can be done at that point is you, on the ribbon here with their name, expand that section down. Okay, you'll see the information that's been entered in for them. Okay, you can also associate them to different groups here. You can assign them a different provider role here as well. Okay, you can add them in, select it from the drop down, and then click add. You can also delete the user if the user is no longer part of the group. Maybe they're no longer employed with your office. You can actually delete the user. And then you can edit. So if you edit the user, this is where you can help them reset their password. And what you're going to do is click the reset registration. And what that does is that's actually going to send an email to the email address that they have on file. And it's going to tell them to click here, kind of like the link we looked at earlier. And it's going to walk them through the steps on how to reset their registration. So if I click reset registration, it's going to remove all the associations with their multi-factor authentication. Okay. So that's what you're actually doing, is resetting their multi-factor authentication. So it's not just a forgot the password process, but they're going to have to go back through that multi-factor registration process as well, where they enter in their email address and they verify a phone number, where they have to do that two-step authentication, just like we did when we created the original account. Okay. If you say okay, the registration is reset, and that person will not actually be able to log in until they go through the multi-factor process again. Okay, so they'll receive an email which will walk them through the steps. They'll have a link to click and it'll walk them through the steps. The other option is on the home screen. If we were to log out, they would then have to go through the multi-factor authentication process again. Okay. If something happens when you are attempting to register and you're having difficulty, there is a little help guide right here where you can click here. So you would use this one here for the provider users. It just gives you a few tips and tricks. If you forgot your password, it walks you through that as well. Okay. The other thing is the multi-factor authentication help. So if someone is having trouble with the multi-factor authentication, there's a link right here under incomplete registration where they can click this link here and it actually picks them up where they left off, and it helps them finish that registration process. Okay. Just a couple other things to note. After you have created your account, you've done your registration, you've done your multi-factor authentication, when it's time to log in, you're actually going to log in here. So you'll click login, okay? And I didn't mean to actually click it. Before you click login, if you actually click this remember me, what's going to happen is if you use the same computer all day long, this will allow you to be able to bypass the multi-factor authentication for the entire workday. And what you'll be able to do then is you'll be able to log in. Okay, we're going to actually change this here to okay, so we're going to enter in the email address and the password we set up. Okay. And it's going to want to send a code to verify. Okay, you'll get the code in your text. Once you get the code, you enter this here, click verify code, and it's logged you in. Okay, so what happens next is well, I'm going to go ahead and log out. And the other thing to note as well, after 30 minutes of inactivity, it'll automatically log you out also. So as you get distracted and busy throughout the workday, you will oftentimes be logged out. Okay. When I go to log in, because the remember me is already selected, if I click log in, it'll actually just log me in. So this will only happen for the workday. So if I go home tonight, come back in tomorrow, then I am going to have to do the multi-factor authentication. That's just verification. It's just security purposes, but it will allow you to just log in with the click of a button as long as you're on the same device. If you log in from a different computer, it's not going to remember you. Okay, so it's just kind of like some of the other things that you do with your banks and credit cards or other private accounts where you have to just verify that you are you. And that's just how we keep our member information safe and secure. Okay, so that's the multi-factor. Again, as the provider administrator, you can add additional users. When they come to register, they do not have to do the registration. So those users I've added, their process will start here with the multi-factor authentication. So they'll click here to complete their registration process, and they'll be able to register the rest of the way there. They will then also be able to do the remember me login option as long as they're on the same device throughout the same time period throughout the day. Okay. I thank you very much for joining the presentation today.
Thank you for attending Kepro's training. We look forward to working with you.